This video goes through the first few points on the checklist for the transport in humans topic, including the importance of circulatory systems for complex organisms, and the structure of the heart and the function of the heart and the route of blood through the heart. So starting with simple organisms then, so we're first thinking about single-celled organisms. Because of their small size, they can rely only on diffusion in order to obtain key molecules, oxygen, getting rid of carbon dioxide. Other nutrient molecules can just diffuse straight across their cell membrane, so straight into their cytoplasm, because there's a very short diffusion distance. No part of their cell is particularly far away from their outside surface. What this means is that they have a relatively small volume for their surface area. What we say is that they've got therefore a large surface area to volume ratio. So they've got a relatively large surface area compared to having quite a small volume. And this means that they can efficiently absorb substances and distribute them easily around their body just using diffusion. Multicellular organisms are slightly different then. So they've got a large volume because they're much larger organisms. They're made up of many cells. And relative to that large volume is that they actually have a relatively small surface area. So if you think about the surface area of the external surface of the fish relative to how many cells there are and relative to the total volume of the fish, is that the ratio between volume and surface area is the other way around. So they've got a smaller surface area relative to having a larger volume. What this means is that they're unable to absorb sufficient nutrients, sufficient oxygen from their environment just by diffusion, and so they need to have circulatory systems and respiratory systems. So they need to have transport systems in order to get those key molecules from outside of the organism to all of the cells that require them. Moving to think about humans then, our transport system comprises of the heart, the blood and the blood vessels, and that's what a large bulk of this topic is about. And so the next bit that we're going to be talking about is the kind of circulatory system of humans as a whole, but also about the heart. Circulatory systems as a whole transport blood, it's about transporting oxygen, it's about transporting carbon dioxide and other nutrients. When we talk about what the components of blood are, is we'll think a little bit more about how each of these different molecules are transported, where they're transported, and any adaptations to help their transport. But that just gives you a bit of a general overview of what the circulatory system is looking to do. So these two pictures here are a comparison between the circulatory systems of a fish compared to our own circulatory system. Now, our circulatory system is called a double circulatory system, and what that means is that it comprises of two circuits. One that goes to the lungs and the second one that goes to the body. So we can see then that it can be referred to as a double pump. This is all about efficiency when it comes to transporting oxygen. So the first pump transporting oxygen poor blood to the lungs to become oxygenated, and then the second transporting oxygen rich blood around the body. That's quite different to what we can see on the left hand side here of a single circulatory system for a fish. So single circulatory system, so blood is pumped by a heart first to the gas exchange organ, which in this case is going to be the gills, and then goes directly from the gills around the body of the organism. That's in total contrast then to the double circulatory system of humans, where the heart pumps blood first from the heart to the lungs, so that the blood can be oxygenated. That blood then returns from the lungs back to the heart to be pumped a second time from the heart around the body. What this means is that blood passes through the heart twice in each complete cycle. So now we're looking at a general overview of the circulatory system in humans. There's a few key blood vessels that you do need to be able to identify on a diagram. There are a couple on here that you actually aren't expected to be able to identify. So starting with the blood vessels that directly are associated with the heart, we've got there the pulmonary vein. So that's going to be returning blood from the lungs back into the left side of the heart, into a structure called the left atrium. We've then got a structure called the aorta, which is an artery which is taking blood away from the heart from the left ventricle. Scrolling down to these two boxes here, we've got the blood vessels of the kidney. So we've got the renal artery going from the heart, this will be coming from the aorta that we just labelled, to the kidneys, and then we've got the renal vein coming from the kidneys. Next up, we've got the vena cava, which is a vein delivering blood back into the right side of the heart, into the right atrium. And then we've got two blood vessels going to from the head that you actually don't need to know about for Edexcel, which is the carotid artery and the jugular vein. So just to highlight the ones that you do need to know, so we've got the four blood vessels of the heart and lungs, with the vena cava, the aorta, the pulmonary vein, and the pulmonary artery. Now that word pulmonary means that it's a blood vessel that is associated with the lungs. Next one down on the diagram, we've got the hepatic blood vessels, so hepatic vein, hepatic artery, and hepatic portal vein. Now the word hepatic means that those blood vessels are associated with the liver. The only one that will prove to be slightly more difficult to learn is hepatic portal vein, because it goes against some of the other conventions. And then, as I mentioned, we've got the renal blood vessels, so renal artery and renal vein, and the word renal means that they are blood vessels associated with the kidneys. So those ones that are highlighted there, the ones that you do need to know for Edexcel. Thinking then a little bit about specifically the structure of the heart, and about why the heart is so efficient with this double circulatory system again. So because blood is pumped twice, is that a higher blood pressure can be maintained throughout the entire route of the blood all the way around the body. What this also means is that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood are kept apart, which means that we never have a situation where deoxygenated blood is being pumped around the body. That would be a waste of energy, to be contracting the muscles to send deoxygenated blood around to the tissues of the body, because they need oxygen in order to respire. So what we do have then is that deoxygenated blood is pumped to the lungs, not to the body, and that oxygenated blood is pumped to the body and not to the lungs. Okay then, having a look at this diagram. Now you'll see lots of diagrams, but this is just a nice simple one just to get us started. The first thing that I would always advise you to do is to label up the right and the left side of the heart. So the heart will always be drawn as if it were a person facing you, which means that the left and right are always going to be the other way around. Okay, we're going to start with labeling the four chambers of the heart. So we've got first top two chambers, which are the atria. The singular of the word atria is atrium. So if you're just referring to, in this case, the right atrium, then you would say atrium. But if you were referring to both of them, then it would be atria. And then on the other side, we've got the left atrium. The bottom two chambers of the heart are the ventricles. And again, we've got a right ventricle and a left ventricle. Now, if you look at the thickness of the wall there of the left ventricle compared to the right ventricle, is that the left ventricle is thicker. This is because the left ventricle wall does contain a lot more muscle tissue. Next, we're going to label up the four blood vessels associated with the heart. So I usually start with the vena cava, because that's going to be where blood is entering into the heart for the first time from the body. We often think about the route of blood going through the heart as starting with blood coming back from the body into the vena cava. This blood, I'm just using blue arrows because this blood will be deoxygenated if it's coming back from the body, and the blood will move down into the atria, then down into the ventricle, and then up and out through an artery called the pulmonary artery. Now you remember from our diagram just before that that's a blood vessel associated with the lungs, so that's the artery that's going to take blood away from the heart to the lungs. Blood will then return to the heart. Now I've swapped to using a red arrow there, because now the blood is going to be oxygenated, and that blood's going to be entering in through the pulmonary vein. So again, pulmonary because it's a blood vessel to do with the lungs, and vein because it's blood returning to the heart. And again, the blood will move down into the left atrium, into the left ventricle, and then up and out of the heart through the largest artery in the body, which is called the aorta. So this is a very, very large artery. It's got very, very thick walls. It has to withstand a great deal of pressure that's being generated from the left ventricle, and that will branch out to all the different parts of the body so that all the different parts of the body get a blood supply of oxygenated blood. And then, as I've labelled there on the bottom, so the right side of the heart deals exclusively with deoxygenated blood and the left side contains exclusively oxygenated blood. So there's no mixing of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood between the left and the right side of the heart. And that is kept separate by a structure called the septum. So that runs down the centre of the heart, keeping the left and the right side separate, so keeping oxygenated and deoxygenated blood from mixing. Now, importantly, between the atria and the ventricles, and also between the ventricles and the arteries, there are valves. Now, valves have a really vital role in that they prevent backflow of blood. So we've got two named valves here, the tricuspid valve, which goes from, which is between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and the bicuspid valve, which is between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now, both of these valves are responsible for preventing backflow of blood from the ventricles back into the atria. So when the left ventricle contracts, it's really important that blood flows out through the artery and not back into the atria. Now, there's two different methods you can use to try to remember those names and which way around they are. One is to think about it as try before you buy, thinking about the right side of the heart, then the left side of the heart. And then another one that I came across quite recently is that tricuspid and right side of the heart both have that RI. We've then got one more set of valves here. So these are between the ventricles, both the left and right ventricle, and the arteries, pulmonary artery and aorta. And these are called the semilunar valves. Again, they're just going to be preventing backflow of blood, but this time from the artery back into the ventricles. Just a couple of summary points then about the heart. So the heart is made of a type of muscle called cardiac muscle. It is different in terms of its structure, slightly different in terms of its structure, and different in terms of its function to muscle that we see in skeletal muscles, so things like the biceps, triceps, but also smooth muscle that we would see in the organs is also different to this cardiac muscle. What makes cardiac muscle really special is that it's got a property which is called being myogenic. What this means is that cardiac muscle can contract by itself. So it doesn't require a nerve impulse from outside of the heart in order to cause the heart to contract. So the heart muscle itself can initiate its own contractions. The heart's also got its own blood vessels, the coronary arteries, the coronary blood vessels, which we've come across before a little bit when we talked about risks of smoking and coronary heart disease. And these coronary arteries branch off from the aorta. As part of regulating the heartbeat is that there are cells called pacemaker cells, which what they do is that they can increase and decrease the heart rate. But as I said before, the cardiac muscle can contract by itself. So really they're just there to keep everything contracting at the right pace. And then with the left side of the heart, as I said, the left side is thicker. What this means is that there's more muscle. More muscle can generate more force with each contraction, and so the left side is able to generate higher pressure. It's able to pump blood out of the heart at a higher pressure. This is important because blood that's leaving the heart from the left side needs to travel further than blood that's leaving the heart from the right side. So from the right side, blood only needs to be able to go to the lungs, whereas from the left side, it needs to be able to go all the way around the body. And with this bit, I would suggest you give these questions a go first before watching through me putting in the answers for it. But in terms of the four chambers then, we've got left and right atrium and the left and right ventricle. With the valves then, so two sets of valves, so we've got the semilunar valve and then the tricuspid and bicuspid valve can also be referred to as the atrioventricular valves. They've got that name because they are found between the atria and the ventricles. So semilunar valves are between the ventricles and the arteries, and then the tricuspid and bicuspid valves, which are also called atrioventricular valves, are between the atria and the ventricles. The function of all valves in the heart is to prevent backflow of blood. The only difference between the semilunar valves and the atrioventricular valve is just where the blood could backflow from and where the blood could be backflowing to. So whether it's preventing backflow from the ventricles back into the atria, or whether it's preventing backflow from the artery back into the ventricles. It's all about maintaining a one-way flow of blood through the heart so that blood always flows in one direction through the heart. In from the vein to the atria, into the ventricle, and then out through the arteries on both sides, always going in that same direction. Left side of the heart, as we've just said, the left ventricle has more muscle because it needs to be able to generate more force so that it's pumping out the blood at a higher pressure because that blood needs to be able to travel further. So it's about the fact that the left side needs to be able to pump blood all around the body, whereas the right side is just pumping blood to the lungs. This next bit I would definitely suggest that you give it a go before watching through this one. So thinking about it as the steps first. From the lungs, blood will then travel through the pulmonary vein. From the pulmonary vein, the blood will then enter the heart into the left atrium. Going from the left atrium, then it will pass through the bicuspid valve, which will take the blood into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will then contract, forcing the blood through the semilunar valve and out of the heart through the aorta. Now this question is asking specifically about taking blood to the kidney, so we will then have the blood going from the aorta into the renal artery, so renal because it's a blood vessel of the kidney, and then it would enter into the tissues of the organ. This question is not asking you to do this, but I'm just going to fill in what would have been the other side of this as well. So going from the kidney all the way back to the lungs as well, so that we've got a complete route. So from the kidney then we would have another renal blood vessel, this time the renal vein, because the blood is going back towards the heart. Then to the vena cava, so that major vein of the heart where blood is coming back from the body into the heart. Blood will enter into the heart into the right atrium. Right atrium will then contract, forcing the blood through, this time the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle. Right ventricle will contract, forcing the blood through the semilunar valve. That blood is then pumped into the pulmonary artery, so pulmonary again because it's a blood vessel associated with the lungs, artery because it's taking blood away from the heart. And then finally we would see blood being returned to the lungs. So we can see there that we've got a complete circuit of blood between the lungs and the kidneys and back again. If we think a little bit then about the properties of the blood that we would see. Now, coming from the lungs, the blood would be oxygenated. And that would be the case all the way up until that blood reached the kidneys, where the kidneys would be respiring. They would be taking in that oxygen. The tissue, the cells of the kidney would be taking in that oxygen, and then we would have deoxygenated blood leaving the kidneys and then eventually returning back to the lungs. We can think as well about the pressure. Now it cuts off slightly on the side of the video here, but the pulmonary vein is going to be at very low pressure. So when leaving the lungs, the blood will be at very low pressure, and then when leaving the heart into the aorta is the absolute highest pressure that we would see. And then leaving the kidney again, coming from the organ, the pressure would be very low. You notice there that it's the veins where the pressure is at the lowest, and then we've got high pressure from the leaving the heart into the pulmonary artery. So we've got high pressure in the arteries and lower pressure in the veins.